Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
16 years from today, Greg Gerstner will finally land the perfect cannonball. Epic splash. Unsuspecting friends. A work of art only possible because Greg is already meeting all these same people at AARP volunteer and community events that keep him active and involved and help make sure his happiness lives as long as he does. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/local.
Years ago, one of the only legal ways to access porn was to walk into a store, show some ID, and purchase a magazine or video. Today, the concept is almost laughable. I don't even think most minors even realize they're doing something illegal when they search for porn online. When something is trivially easy, like jaywalking, or setting off fireworks, or finding porn on the internet, it feels legal. But over the past 3 years, legislators in nearly half of U.S. states have passed laws to try to end the porn free-for-all. The goal, they say, is to stop kids from viewing adult content by forcing porn sites to verify the ages of their users. This episode is about how policy can backfire and raises questions about how governments can even begin regulating what kids do on the internet. My name's Jerusalem Demsis. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic, and this is Good on Paper, a policy show that questions what we really know about popular narratives. My guest today is Zeve Sanderson. He's the executive director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics and a research associate at the school's Center on Technology Policy. In a new study, Zeve and his co-authors find that the effects of these laws are not as policymakers intended. While there was a 51% reduction in searches for Pornhub, which complied, there was a nearly commensurate increase in searches for the dominant non-compliant platform, Xvideos. We wanted to give Xvideos an opportunity to respond to this story and the claims that they are not complying with U.S. state laws. We requested a comment from the company, but have yet to hear back from them. Let's dive in. Zeve, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're going to start with a non-controversial question. Do you think porn is bad for kids?
So it's a good question. One of the challenges with answering this question and answering many of the questions right now around sort of insert a particular type of digital media, including social media, and that effect on kids, is that it's really hard to run sort of causal studies on...
Yeah, you're not going to randomly assign kids to watch porn.
Exactly, and which is actually sort of a big issue when it comes to, like, is porn bad for kids?
Yeah.
And so there's a fair amount of correlational work. I sort of want to flag that my focus is on political communications and on tech policy. So I obviously have a broad understanding of the literature, but I myself am not a psychologist. Mm-hmm. As I understand the literature, studies have shown sort of that adolescent exposure to online pornography is associated with things that we would consider to be normatively bad. Things like body image concerns, mm-hmm. lower self-esteem, and increased acceptance of sort of aggressive sexual scripts, which may normalize sort of sexual aggression more broadly in intimate contexts. However, again, these are purely correlative, and so drawing that sort of causal connection is hard in general, but especially hard, like you said, when we're not going to run like an RCT where we expose kids to pornography.
Hey, kids, do you want to join this fun study?
Yeah, I can't imagine any university ethics board
Is
that would go
allow
along with that.
Yeah, that's like a 1960s type study. And if they didn't do it then, we're not going to get it now.
Right.
Okay, but like, what do you think? Like, you've spent a lot of time in this space, right? I get that it's correlational, but the problem with this kind of research is that we have to make policy even though we don't have RCTs. So, do you think it's more plausible that porn is making kids, less happy, have body image issues, express more anxiety, have negative things that we would consider bad social scripts regarding gender relations? Or do you think it's mostly, if not all, selection, that the kids who already kind of have those traits are the ones more likely to be using porn or admit to using porn in surveys?
So I think that it broadly depends on contextual factors, right? So like, kids with access to comprehensive sex education and strong parental communication sort of demonstrate in research a greater ability to critically evaluate pornographic content. That said, I think one of the interesting things about this policy space is that there's actually pretty broad acceptance that trying to block access of kids watching porn is a good thing that everyone wants to move towards. Even Pornhub and the Free Speech Coalition, which is the sort of professional lobbying group of the adult entertainment industry, are all sort of directionally on board with kids shouldn't have access to adult content. As I'm sure we'll discuss on this show, though, the challenge becomes how do you move from there to like a set of policy interventions that actually work?
So set the stage for us a bit here about porn usage among kids and to the best of our knowledge. How much usage do we see? How much do we see it differ by gender? What's the age of first exposure, as best as we can tell?
Yeah, so in terms of what we know, a lot of it, like we discussed, starts from survey-based studies because we're not going to be treating kids with certain type of adult content. And so surveys suggest that first exposure typically occurs between ages of 11 and 13. And so I think one of the interesting pieces is that we have always attempted to restrict kids' access to porn. And before the internet, that largely was done via needing to show an ID at a convenience store or an adult shop in order to get access to the products that they were selling. The internet really complicated things, and policymakers in the 90s largely tried to solve this and failed. The main laws that were passed were struck down on First Amendment grounds. And so as a result, what we've sort of gotten in this shift from primarily offline access to primarily online access has largely been self-regulation, right? So if you access an adult website, they have a pop-up that asks you to verify if you're over 18. In sort of more nascent examples, there was a adult video game called Leisure Suit Larry in the 80s that would ask trivia questions as an age verification system.
Wait, like what?
Who is Spiro Agnew, Nixon's former VP?
That kind of maybe it also shuts out a bunch of adults too, right?
Totally. Yeah. No, I mean, it would be a weird cross-section of very precocious kids and adults who have access to it. Another funny one is that one of the questions was O.J. Simpson is, and it was a multiple choice, and it was 1987, and one of the wrong answers was under indictment. And so,
what?
So there would also be sort of a time feature to who had access to this.
Funny. It's kind of like, what was I don't know if this is an apocryphal story or a real one, but there's the park ranger trying to design a trash can, and they're like, you have to make sure the trash can, he's like, the overlap between the smartest bear and the dumbest human is quite large. So designing trash cans in national parks is difficult.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, I think that sets the stage for us a bit here because we've seen in recent years kind of more attention towards how regulators can really engage in this space. The internet's kind of like the Wild West, and it's a place where you don't see a ton of regulation, not because I think there's not a desire to do so, but people kind of feel like it's futile, which is maybe a theme of this podcast today. But my colleague Mark Novikov, he wrote a great article in The Atlantic that he goes over some of kind of the personal history here in Louisiana. So Louisiana passes a law to force pornography websites or websites containing, quote, substantial adult content to verify their users' ages. And Mark writes that it happened in part because the Louisiana Republican State Representative Lori Schlegel decided to act. Schlegel is a sex and porn addiction counselor and had heard Billie Eilish describe how porn had affected her as a child. Quote, I started watching porn when I was like 11, Eilish said on the Howard Stern show. I think it really destroyed my brain, and I feel incredibly devastated that I was exposed to so much porn. Obviously, this is not like Billie Eilish is not solely responsible for this trend, but I think that those kinds of accounts have become more common as, you know, the internet generation has grown up and are now adults and reflecting back on their own experiences. And you have some people kind of having the same experience as Billie. So can you walk us through Louisiana's law? What did Act 440 do?
Yeah, so essentially what Act 440 did, it was implemented on January 1st, 2023. And there were a few key features of what it was doing. So the first is that it set specific technical requirements for verification providers. So these are going to be the providers that essentially sit between a website that hosts adult content and a user in order to verify the user's age. The second is that it clearly defined covered content and websites, and it also introduced substantial penalties for non-compliance.
And what were those penalties?
So the penalties were not to exceed $5,000 for each day of violation and not to exceed $10,000 for failure to perform reasonable age verification. One of the challenges in actually implementing this, though, is that, you know, people in Louisiana, like everywhere in the world, have access to websites all over the world. And so if there is a website that sits, you know, the servers are in another country, and let's say it's owned by a company in another country, and they have no sort of U.S. legal presence, being able to actually levy those penalties against companies is pretty much impossible, and thus companies don't have to comply. So
in the paper, you kind of go over your goal is to see how this law and other laws in other states, 21 states have passed similar laws. Are they all kind of in the same form as Act 440, or is there a lot of variation?
So 21 states have passed age verification. Mm-hmm. 18 states, the laws are in effect. And 3, they're going into effect this summer.
Okay.
Interestingly, 17 other states in D.C. are also considering age verification bills. So the question then is how similar are they? In short, they're relatively similar. They're all based off of sort of a similar model for the policy. Where they really differ, though, is the technical requirements or the mechanism for age verification. Mm-hmm. And as a result, you actually see Louisiana be a little bit of an outlier relative to the other 17 states where the laws are in effect, because Louisiana has a digital ID program called LA Wallet. Mm. And part of the sort of age verification mechanism in Louisiana specifically is able to leverage LA Wallet in order to give users access to adult content in a privacy-preserving way. Whereas in other states, they had different age verification mechanisms, including uploading a copy of a government-issued ID, like a driver's license, relying on a third-party vendor to verify a user's age using various data. And all of these were relatively privacy invasive. And so as a result of these other laws, Pornhub, which is the most popular adult website in the U.S., pulled out of all of those states. The only state where it's still active in which an age verification law has passed is Louisiana.
Wow. And the reason for that is because it was concerned about privacy?
So it's concerned about a bunch of different things, all of which are extremely valid, right? So one is privacy, right? Does the user have to turn over any personally identifiable information to a service, and in particular to the website that's doing the verifying, like Pornhub, that at some point could be used to re-identify that user. That's one of the main concerns. And the re-identification could obviously happen in certain ways. It could be everything from a hack, and so a ton of users' history of actually, watching particular adult content is made visible. But it could also, there are other legal mechanisms, right, by which somebody could access it, like potentially a subpoena. And so there's this big question, which was, how was age verification being done, who was doing it, and whether users' privacy was protected. And at least Pornhub's perspective was that Louisiana was the only state where they felt comfortable complying with the law versus just pulling out entirely.
So part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you is because you had a pre-analysis plan and pre-registration of your study. For folks who don't know what that is, can you explain why that's important?
So essentially what a pre-analysis plan is it specifies the way that we're going to analyze data before we see those data. And that's really important because it gets around some of the issues that I know you've been interested in and your colleague Derek Thompson has been interested in around the ability to do really good, open, transparent science that we can trust. And this is one way of doing it. It's sort of calling your shot, almost Babe Ruth style, pointing over the fence.
Yeah.
And it doesn't allow us to do some things afterwards where we researchers have been shown at times to essentially use statistical methods in order to find an effect that often doesn't replicate in the future because it really wasn't as robust or rigorous as we wanted. And pre-registration is one of the tools that we have to do that.
And so what did you expect the impact would be then? Because you pre-registered, kind of locking in your hypothesis ahead of time.
Yeah, we largely expected what in fact has happened, which was that there were aligning with the theme of the show, all sorts of unintended consequences that maybe took this policy that was good on paper and at best complicated it, and at worst has suggested that it's ineffective or potentially even harmful.
So walk us through those. What were the main findings of your paper?
Yeah, so we had sort of three primary questions. The first is, did compliant websites see lower search volume as a result of the laws? The second was, did non-compliant websites see higher search volume as a result of the laws? And the final was did people search for VPNs, which would help them circumvent these laws? Mm-hmm. And I should mention that we use Google Trends data for a few different reasons. The first is that it's granular and it's free and it's accessible. And so what that allowed us to do was actually drill down with some temporal granularity to see the way that search volume around these topics, in our case, Pornhub, which was the compliant firm, Xvideos, which is the most popular non-compliant website in the U.S., and then searches for VPNs. We were interested to see how those shifted over time. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Google search results are imperfect. We would prefer to have access to the actual sort of data of who was visiting these websites. However, that's not data that's freely available. It actually costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so instead we use Google search results. But what we do is we look at the correlation between sort of Google Trends data and similar web data, which actually looks directly at traffic at the national level, and we show very high levels of correlation. And so we expect that what we're seeing in our results would actually sort of directionally align with real sort of actual visits to those sites.
Give us a sense of the magnitudes here. How much did you see search traffic decline towards the compliant websites?
Yeah, so for the compliant website, again, we focus specifically on Pornhub because it's the most popular adult content website in the country. We see over the 3 months after implementation, search volume drops 51%.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think one of the important things to emphasize about Google Trends data, it's relative. Yeah. So we actually don't know exactly how many searches someone did. Instead, it's normalized on this sort of 0 to 100 scale, where 100 is the peak search interest in the given region in the given time. So in this case, it would be the states that we were focusing on in the time period of the study. So we also think about this in a slightly different way that might be more meaningful, which is that Pornhub lost about 4.4 weeks of peak search traffic over those 3 months. Mm. Similarly, or rather conversely, we saw X videos, which didn't comply with the laws, see a dramatic increase in search volume. So over the 3 months after sort of state implementation, we saw searches increase 48.1%, which similar to the previous statistic, would sort of account for roughly a 3.62 week gain of their peak traffic during that period.
So it's like almost offsetting the decline in Pornhub traffic.
Yeah. So, I mean, because Pornhub started at a higher level, it doesn't fully offset it.
Yeah.
But it does. It certainly offsets some of it.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
And one of the other interesting things, though, right, when you can think about this law as attempting to do many things, right? The main thing that it's attempting to do is protect kids from having access to adult content. But there's also this economic effect, which is that these are really large websites that make a lot of money. And what you've effectively done via these laws is you have like benefited a firm that was non-compliant because it was non-compliant. Which creates these really perverse incentives in this sort of regulatory environment where non-compliance allows you to gain market share from your main competitor that complies with the laws.
But I mean, I guess like on the first question, it seems like probably you did see less people watching porn online given the information that you had. I would expect there is a decline, even if it is offset by increased traffic to non-compliant sites.
Yeah, so I largely agree that what I would assume is that there probably was some drop in overall porn consumption in these states. Again, it's tough for us to tell because we're using Google search data. And one person when we were presenting this paper asked, "Who searches for porn? Like, why is this actually good data to use?"
So funny. Any question you ask is a confession in this space.
Totally. But one of the reasons that we think this is that these data end up being relevant to our question and why we would see this behavior is because if you go in, Chrome is the most popular browser in the U.S. And if you go into the bar and you type in a word, let's say you type in New York Times and you don't put .com, it does a Google search, and it would do the same thing for pornography. And so what we expect is happening here is people essentially are just sort of, typing in a word, and that's why we're picking up, it as in the overall search volume. Yeah,
I mean, like, I guess the way I would think about it, if this was going to matter a lot, is people who are, I guess, more sophisticated porn users, whether they have like pages saved or whatever, those folks are less likely to come up on Google search as part of that traffic. And then so you're getting, I don't know what it means to be a less sophisticated porn watcher, but using that terminology, like those folks are the ones you're largely capturing because...
Yeah, but I think there's sort of an important dynamic here bringing us back to kids, which again is the focus of the law, which is if we describe this dynamic, right, the major adult website in the country complies with laws. In one state, they actually have age verification. In all the other states that pass these laws, they pull out. And it requires either substitution or circumvention, right? You either need to substitute with a different website or you need to circumvent via some technology like a VPN. If I just said, who's probably better positioned to navigate this new sort of legal environment if they are motivated to access adult content, digitally native kids or adults, I think, as people living in the world, even though we don't have direct access to this data, our priors would probably be that kids are much better sort of equipped to substitute and circumvent. And so in some ways, even if we saw overall porn consumption drop, which again is sort of something that we hope to test in the future, I personally wouldn't really expect kids to be part of that drop, right? I mean, they're quite ingenious at getting around technical barriers.
You think they wouldn't have dropped at all?
I'm not sure.
I think I would expect that there's some drop. Like there are some people who are just like marginally like, okay, I'm not going to search this now.
Anytime you add friction to anything,
exactly,
you're never really going to, it's very rare to see an increase as a result of the friction. So again, our prior should be, you would see some drop. But the challenge, of course, is like, how much of a drop was there? And for the kids, or for everybody, but especially the kids who are still consuming content that, the policymakers and the public are quite concerned about, has that content changed?
Yeah.
And I think that like that's a really important question for the policy community to ask here, because these two firms are not the same, right? Pornhub and Xvideos are qualitatively different, if only to start because we know that one complies with the law and the other doesn't.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to talk about this, though, this noncompliance, because I think that obviously you probably would see a much larger decrease if there were no major non-compliant websites at all. Yes, some people would figure out VPNs, but a lot of people have trouble figuring that out and like don't know what that is or don't know how to set it up. And like it's not like crazy complicated, but like it does take some effort to set that up for yourself. And it feels a little bit more illegal than just, I'll just go to the next site on Google. That's a very different sort of friction you've created for people, to use your language there. But the reason Xvideos is non-compliant, right, is in part because the government wasn't willing to like go nuclear and say, ISPs, you have to stop hosting websites that are non-compliant, right?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously it's possible to do that sort of with a scalpel, right? To say, okay, ISPs don't route any data from Xvideos to the states that have passed these laws. I've made the mistake exactly once in a public context of speculating on legal questions, so I'll try not to do that again here. But my guess is that would need to come from the federal government, given its various sort of effects on other states. There's also been a lot of development in much more sophisticated age verification protocols that many of the states just decided not to take up here. And to a certain extent, that wouldn't solve this problem, which is that any age verification protocol will be accompanied by some level of friction. And so, if any level of friction is a deterrent to use a compliant site, then maybe you would still see people move over to non-compliant sites. But there were much better ways to age verify with fewer privacy considerations, where potentially we wouldn't have seen such stark effects. That said, we saw stark effects in Louisiana, where Pornhub stayed active in the state, where they had this sort of digital wallet. And, in our numbers, like I mentioned, we sort of show in the 40 to 50% drop, depending on the state. But Pornhub itself actually reports an 80% drop in volume from Louisiana after the law, so even larger than ours.
After the break, is there really a right to access porn privately?
The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
I want to ask you about this privacy question because I think it's at the core of a lot of the pushback to this. Because, like as you said, there are a lot of people who would be, amenable to stopping or blocking kids from accessing this sort of content. But when it runs up against their own as adults' ability to access adult content or any kind of content on the internet without the government having to, verify their ID or their age, I think that's when it becomes kind of tricky for a lot of people. And I started thinking of this because, I'm a digital native. I grew up, on the internet. I was on Tumblr with my pseudonymous account, and I enjoyed being anonymous on the internet. That was, a fun thing, and I think that can be valuable. And, there are free speech concerns and, of course, political activism concerns with the government intervening too much in this space and with corporations intervening too much in this space. But at the same time, the expectation that your access to pornography is private is pretty new. It was it's hard to realize how I feel like I was watching a Gilmore Girls episode where I realized like how normal this was, and they were like, there's like a back room of the video store where they're all like going to get porn, and I was just like, what? I can't even believe this. But it's like that's genuinely the main way that people were or they were going to get shipped to their house. But you had to have, there was already verification with these steps. Like you had to have some sort of verification happening. It was like difficult to get it. Obviously kids were still able to like, get someone else's magazine, have someone buy it for them. But in the same way that we ban alcohol, even though some kids can get around it, we see that as possible. So walk me through how you think about this privacy question, because it is, I think, one where, my knee-jerk reaction around the internet is that I care about privacy, but it also isn't that, it is quite new to demand a right to privacy around getting porn. Like that's like quite novel.
Yeah, so I feel like in this episode, I probably have already pissed off some psychologists, some First Amendment lawyers, and now I'll add the privacy community to the mix. But so I think that there are sort of two things here, right? So the first is that I sort of broadly agree with you, right? This is sort of like a novel privacy right to affirm that we can have access to porn in a fully private setting where we don't need to sort of like affirm our identity in any way. However, on the other hand, in order to build a sort of identity architecture into age verification across various, websites and apps, we really need to sort of fundamentally rethink the way the internet works.
Yeah.
And I don't want to pretend like trying to solve the problem around age verification on adult content would get rid of like anonymity everywhere. That's certainly not the case. But I do want to emphasize that really thinking about identity affirmation online is something that comes with all sorts of trade-offs and broadly is not the norm, right? Broadly, we don't need, while we might need to identify ourselves as a user, right? We have a username and a password. In many contexts, we don't actually need to turn over any personally identifying information about ourselves. And so one of the interesting things here is that this is where a lot of work and really exciting work has been done. And there are various methods for thinking about how you might be able to do age verification in a way that actually does preserve privacy. I don't really want to go into like I think the technical details in some ways are less important than the overall logic here. And the logic is that you sort of have a service or a platform or a website on one side that needs to verify someone's age. And on the other side, you have another service that knows at minimum an age range. And what you really want to do in order to effectively do age verification while preserving privacy is let the website know that a particular user is above or below a certain age without letting that website know anything about that user and without letting the age verification system know what website is asking the question. So recently, Apple came out with a white paper where they sort of proposed a particular mechanism by which parents sort of set up child accounts, and they have an age range that is stored sort of like on the phone, and that age range can be made available to apps via the App Store. But again, these sort of two things aren't really talking to each other. And obviously, Apple has sort of long held privacy as a core of what they're doing. So yes, there's some companies doing this. I really hate saying this word at all, but like this is an application for a blockchain or some sort of
I was waiting for it. I knew it was going to come up.
or some sort of distributed technology. There's been a lot of technical advancements in something called zero knowledge proofs, which is essentially a protocol in which one party can convince another party that some given statement is true without conveying sort of any information to the verifier beyond the fact of that statement, right? So like that's the sort of like logic of the computation that's going on. And so, again, not a crypto person, though I think that in general, thinking about genuinely useful applications of distributed of sort of distributed technologies is interesting, and this might be one.
I wonder from the perspective of trying to attack this from a different actor. Like right now, we've talked a lot about how do you address this from the by finding the website, by making the websites compliant, by creating that sort of change. How do you think about this from a parent standpoint? Like holding parents responsible in the same way we hold them responsible for truancy, for instance, in some states, responsible for installing porn blockers on kids' computers, and, responsible for ensuring that kids are not using this on their smartphones. Like, what do you think about that approach? And is there research that illuminates whether this is actually effective?
Yeah, so I'm really happy you asked this question because it emphasizes, I think, this sort of broad dynamic in tech policy that you can't solve sort of insert societal challenge at the level of tech policy, right? If what we're after is like sort of more developmentally appropriate content consumption broadly around kids because we care about their development, like tech policy, like age verification is going to be one small piece of a much larger policy and non-policy sort of agenda. And parents sort of play a huge role in this.
So when I was doing some research for this episode, I came across this interesting survey because it was that was trying to ask people about their first exposure to pornography. It's not a huge sample, but it was a 2017 study that surveyed 330 undergrad men, 17 to 54 years old. I assume that is an outlier, 54-year-old. But the participants were 85% white, primarily heterosexual, and when they were asked about their first exposure, the mean age was 13.37 years of age, so kind of in line with what you told us at the top of the episode. But what's interesting is that 43% of men indicated that their first exposure was accidental, which reminded me, I mean, again, like who knows, like maybe if you're off asked that, you're likely to say, there's social desirability bias here. You're trying to just say what you're, you don't want to say that you were looking for porn at 12. I have no idea. But, part of what that struck me as is like it is very, very normal, particularly now that X has changed its protocols significantly, to just be like on the internet and like come across porn accidentally. Like that will like happen. Like now you see this on Reels, on TikTok, where you see content that is like very, very close to porn or like porn adjacent, or even like really explicit content on websites that are not normally or predominantly serving that sort of content. And that's something that I think that these sorts of laws really don't do much about, but I would imagine have a larger impact on, adolescents that we're trying to prevent from having to see this in an unwanted way. So, when I was like in elementary school, I remember I was at the school library and these were like big desktop computers, and I see a group of like kids huddled around a computer and I like walk over, and I think I'm like 6 or 7 years old at this point, and they're like just looking at, they're just like, kids too. They're just like looking at porn, they're like laughing, right, and showing this around. And like I remember being like kind of like horrified at what had just occurred. I like kind of like ran away and like pretended it hadn't happened, but like it stuck in my brain for a long time. And I imagine like that's the sort of thing, like beyond just like normal healthy sexual interactions people are having, you're trying to prevent kids from in a way that feels uncomfortable or unwanted having to experience kind of sexual content like that. And so are there laws that can even address something like that? Because that is not something that you can go to like a central provider like Pornhub or X videos or whatever it is. That's just like, as you said, kind of littered throughout the whole internet. Yeah.
So the short answer is yes. There are sort of policy mechanisms by which we could imagine getting there. And I say imagine getting there because, we don't pass a ton of tech policy at the federal level. A lot's being passed at the state level, but for various reasons, a lot of what's being passed at the state level is like it's sort of simple approaches to quite complicated problems. And what I'm about to sort of try to describe is like a complicated problem to try to solve. But you could imagine, let's say on something like X or Reddit or Instagram, that there's some legal requirement where they're making some determination about the type of content that's on the platform, right? So on Instagram, you have two photos. They can have a bunch of sort of automated classifiers running that are able to say this photo is, not adult content and that photo is adult content. And baked into this general push to try to expand age verification sort of across the like social internet, right? Think about what sort of social media platforms kids have access to and how. one of the things that you could do as part of that is if you're age verifying kids to go on social media, you also have legally mandated content filters that strip out adult content from that feed. And it would obviously be imperfect, but it would probably solve for a fair amount of what you just described, which is like large-scale incidental exposure.
Yeah. Doesn't stop random 7-year-olds from, I guess, showing each other porn, but
yeah, though I think that's sort of an age-old problem.
Yeah, exactly. I know that you're not a lawyer, but I did want to ask you about the changing legal environment around these questions. For a long time, as you mentioned, there's been kind of like this distinction between getting porn in person or and you can check ID at like the video store or whatever it is versus getting it online, where there's been sort of a free speech argument that you can't really regulate that in the same way. That might be changing. Can you tell us what's going on?
Yeah, so essentially, there was a major law in the mid-'90s that was passed called the Communications Decency Act, and it was the first really serious piece of federal legislation that attempted to regulate minors' access to online materials. And right, it did it in a few different ways, but ultimately it was struck down, and it was struck down not because the government didn't have a legitimate state interest in regulating or limiting access for kids to adult content, but instead because the court believed that the sort of way that it was happening would have infringed upon the First Amendment right of adults. And so in general, there is sort of this legal precedent that kids' access to adult content is not First Amendment protected speech, so long as the mechanism by which you do it doesn't limit adults' First Amendment protected speech, and that there's a legitimate state interest in attempting to accomplish what I just described. And in the mid-'90s, they really didn't have a good way of doing it. They also, didn't have a great way of like defining what adult content was. I think that largely because age verification mechanisms have gotten so much more sophisticated and granular that like we're more moving towards, and I think we saw this in the court hearings, we're moving towards that because there is this precedence that the state can attempt to regulate kids' access to porn so long as it doesn't infringe upon adults.
So we've kind of, throughout this conversation, really accepted the premise that this is a problem, that children accessing pornography is a problem. And one thing I want to do is just maybe stress test that a bit with you, because some people think this is just another moral panic, whether it's about youth and internet porn, whether it's about smartphones, whether it's about, it's just like comic books, like it's rock music, like it's video games. It's public fear can often race ahead of what the evidence shows. And this is a difficult space where finding really high qualitative causal evidence is difficult, if not impossible to do. Are you afraid that this is kind of just a spun-up moral panic and that's driven by these high-profile anecdotes from Billie Eilish or whatever, and we're having kind of like a social conservative backlash on a bunch of vectors, but that this is really not the sort of thing that requires a bunch of government intervention, and that maybe the best thing to do is just hold off and see if private sector technologies and culture can kind of correct for itself?
I mean, what's interesting to me is this is much more sort of an ethical question than it is an empirical question. Mm-hmm. I think one of the fascinating things studying tech policy in general, and then especially this area, is that the sort of evidentiary standard that we have to sort of be able to definitively say X causes Y is something that in so many areas around sort of technology policy trying to protect kids, we just don't have. And so the question is, what do we do in a context where getting that sort of causal standard or the gold standard for causal evidence probably isn't possible? Mm-hmm. And so whether or not this is a real problem is, I know, a debate in the psychology literature. It's a debate amongst parents. And in many ways, what politics and policymaking is an infrastructure to sort of figure out or come to some consensus of that debate. However, I think the challenge becomes we want policy to do something, right? To have some effect. And as part of that, what we also want then is this sort of evidence-based feedback loop where we're not just sort of passing policy, wiping our hands and saying our job is done, but instead actually doing something similar to what we've done here, right? You could imagine policymakers partnering with academics, pre-registering studies to understand what's the effect of these sort of laws on the outcomes that we're really interested in. Mm-hmm. And so my fear is less that this is just a moral panic, because I think in part, politics is there to figure out, the sort of moral, a distribution of moral preferences across a population. And instead, what I'm more concerned about is that there isn't this really rigorous evidence-based feedback loop where we're able to just continue to iterate and make policy better. And I think this is one area where we've clearly seen it, where we show, look, a compliant firm has dropped a non-compliant firm that platforms sort of content that we would be more concerned about has risen, and it's not clear to me that any laws are going to change as a result. And that's, I don't think, where we want to be in a policy environment.
It feels like a lot is about to change with AI in this space, right? I was on Instagram, and I don't know if you've seen these suggested AI chatbots that they have, and there have been stories of people kind of developing romantic relationships with them. There was a really sad one in the New York Times about a young boy who actually took his own life after having a relationship with a character AI chatbot. I don't know if it's causal there, but the story was indicated that he had really developed a romantic and personal relationship with this AI agent. And it's not going to be just porn websites soon. It's going to be, people are going to have like interactions with AI girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever. And that sort of thing, I think, would require even greater privacy violations to prevent from happening, and would create bigger problems for companies trying to be compliant with regulation. It feels like any solution is going to be kludgy. So if you're going to try to stop kids from accessing porn online, you're going to stop them and adults from accessing a lot of things. And it's going to create a bunch of frictions and annoyance. It's going to create some level of privacy violation, some level of First Amendment violation, and maybe not literally constitutionally, but it's going to create some feeling that your speech has been quelled. And so, I mean, how do you think through this problem? Because to me, if you're asking me, okay, you either have to accept a world where, kids are having really intimate relationships with AI chatbots, and it's degrading their ability or desire to interact with people who they're attracted to in real life, and that continues the degradation of the children's experiences in the real world. I guess real in quotes. It's real to them, but
the embodied world.
The embodied world. That's a better word. Then it's a much more difficult question. I think as policy wonks in DC, we want there to be this like really perfect solution. There's like some technological solution or some sort of policy solution that actually targets the specific thing you're worried about. But largely, a lot of effective policies are effective because they're expansive. So I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, tech policy, like every policy area, is just, a set of trade-offs that we figure out how to navigate. I think if we want to steelman the sort of argument for age verification broadly, is that if we develop sort of low-friction ways of verifying age without any serious sort of privacy violations, we're able to essentially do that quite broadly. But we're never going to be able to be perfect. Perhaps it's that porn dropped somewhat overall, but the stuff that remained shifted to worse places. Like those are the sort of trade-offs that we constantly need to make when we think about policy interventions here.
Yeah.
The one interesting, unique challenge, though, about regulating the sort of digital information space is that the companies that are making these tools or running these platforms have a monopoly on the data they collect. And that's really different than other policy spaces, right? Can you imagine if we needed to figure out sort of like interest rate policy, but some company owned all of the employment rate data, like that would just be this really, really challenging, I would argue, impossible environment in which to craft good policy. And that's essentially what we're doing here. And so I don't think that data access solves everything, but I think one of the things that I wish that there was some sort of momentum around this a few years ago in Congress, and I would love to see it come back up, is as we think about making policies and as we really try to rigorously quantify the trade-offs that will inevitably be there, we need to do so with as much really good data as possible. Otherwise, the fear is that there are all sorts of unintended consequences, the severity of which we're not able to measure. And so I think that needs to be part of any sort of broad solution that we bring to regulating online spaces and online access.
So I think that's a great place for our last and final question. What is something that you thought was a good idea but ended up being only good on paper?
Yeah, so I was a basketball player growing up, and I was a pretty good basketball player, and I ultimately became a mediocre Division I point guard.
That's pretty impressive. This is turning into a humble brag already.
No, not at all. It'll
Okay.
quickly not. I dreamed my entire life of sort of playing in Division I program.
Yeah.
And I got there, I played at Brown. And when I was there, we were sort of the back of the Ivy League, which itself was one of the worst leagues in America. And, I went from like a high school where lots of people would show up to games to a number of friends not even knowing we had a basketball team to, practicing 40 hours a week while all of my other friends were having fun and thinking, is this something that I really want to do? What was it that I was dreaming of?
Well, Zeve, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jerusalem.
Good on Paper is produced by Rosie Hughes. It was edited by Dave Shaw, fact-checked by Enna Alvarado, and engineered by Erica Huang. Our theme music is composed by Rob Smirsiak. Claudia Nabaid is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio. Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. And hey, if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm Jerusalem Dempsis, and we'll see you next week.
To preserve democracy, one has to believe in it. To believe in democracy, one has to understand it. Where it came from, how it works, what's true, what's not true, what others did before you, how it could be better, how to make a difference. I'm David Frum, a staff writer at The Atlantic. I'm starting a new show where each week I'll dig deep into the big questions people have about our politics and our society. I'll explain progress that the peoples of the democratic world have made together and remind you that the American idea is worth defending. Listen to or watch The David Frum Show, wherever you get your podcasts.